In the quiet expanse of Waller County, Texas, a tragedy unfolded that no one could have ever expected. It was January 11, 2023, and just days after the new year, the local police department was thrust into the middle of a nightmare when they received a call that would haunt them forever. The voice on the other end of the line was Jared Dicus, a father who was clearly shaken by what he had just discovered. "My son's wife isn't just dead. She's been decapitated," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. Rodney, along with his wife Lynn, had raised their son Jared Dicus on a rural property, and it was there, in a modest house on the family's land, that the horrors would unfold. Jared, who had only recently married Angie Diaz in October 2022, was now at the center of an unimaginable tragedy. The couple had only been married for a few months, but already cracks were showing in what had appeared to be a fairy tale romance. Their photos from the wedding had been filled with smiles and the excitement of starting a life together. Yet behind the smiles was a deeper story, one that was about to come to a violent and heartbreaking climax. The discovery that Angie had been decapitated in their home was both shocking and disturbing. When Rodney and Lynn went to check on the newlyweds that afternoon, what they found was not just the body of their daughter-in-law, but a crime scene beyond comprehension. Angie's lifeless body was sprawled on the floor, her head nowhere to be found. Panic set in as they immediately called the authorities. As the police arrived at the scene, they were faced with more than just the grisly image of a murder. They were forced to confront the unraveling of a seemingly perfect marriage that had spiraled into chaos. The first responders, already familiar with the Dicus family, were unprepared for the sight that awaited them in the small home. When they arrived, the front door was open, but it was what they saw inside that would stay with them forever. A towel lay on the floor, partially concealing a gruesome scene. The closer they got, the more apparent it became that this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated, horrific act of violence. As they stepped further into the house, the medics could clearly see blood staining the floor, but it wasn't until they saw the body that the true horror began to unfold. Angie had been murdered, and her decapitation was not an isolated incident. The crime scene was filled with clues that pointed to the horror that had taken place in the hours before. The paramedics, shocked and unsure how to handle the situation, immediately backed off. They had seen enough to know this was no accident, and the house was now a crime scene. Jared, who had been present when the body was discovered, was immediately taken into custody by the police. The officers were already aware of his strange behavior and previous incidents that hinted at deeper issues. But was Jared the one responsible for this horrific act, or was something else at play? The investigation would soon reveal a far more complex and disturbing picture of Jared and Angie's relationship. Jared was the obvious suspect. He had been at the scene, and the connection between him and the victim was clear. But what was the motive behind such a brutal crime? Was it a crime of passion, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface of their marriage? The police were quick to start piecing together the details of the couple's relationship. According to Jared's parents, his behavior had been increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to Angie's death. His mother, Lynn, expressed her concerns to the authorities about his recent behavior. But no one could have anticipated that their son, someone who had once seemed like an average, responsible young man, would be capable of such violence. As the investigation continued, Jared's strange actions and comments raised more questions than answers. He claimed to have had no recollection of the events that transpired, but the evidence painted a different picture. His physical presence at the crime scene, his strange behavior in the days leading up to the murder, and the discovery of Angie's phone in his possession all pointed to him as the prime suspect. But why? What had happened to this young couple who just months earlier had been so full of hope for their future? What had gone so terribly wrong? Jared's response to the police's questions was full of contradictions and confusion. He was both evasive and yet too calm in the face of the horror he had been caught up in. Had he really forgotten what had happened, or was he trying to hide the truth? As the police dug deeper into Jared's background, they began to uncover a darker side to his life, one that hinted at a history of substance abuse and emotional instability. In the days that followed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Jared had been struggling with his mental health, and his use of drugs had only made matters worse. Just weeks before Angie's death, Jared had been arrested for driving under the influence. His erratic behavior and emotional volatility were signs that something was deeply wrong. Angie, who had recently moved to the United States to pursue a better life, had been caught in a whirlwind romance with Jared. But as their relationship progressed, Angie began to notice signs of abuse and manipulation. The night before her death, Angie confided in a co-worker that she was planning to leave Jared. She had come to work with visible bruises on her shoulder, and when asked about them, she admitted that the couple had been arguing. She also mentioned that Jared had been controlling and had become increasingly distant. She said she was done with the relationship and was planning to separate, but the decision to leave Jared would cost Angie her life. As the investigation unfolded, the police began to piece together the timeline of events that led up to Angie's murder. Jared had been acting strangely, and his behavior the night of Angie's death raised suspicions. Despite claiming to be under the influence of drugs, Jared's actions seemed more calculated than he was willing to admit. He had killed Angie, but his reasons remained unclear. Was it a crime of passion, or was it something more sinister? An act fueled by jealousy, control, or something even darker? The answers would come, but they would only reveal more about the toxic and destructive relationship that had led to this tragic end. The chilling discovery of Angie's decapitated body was only the beginning of a long and complicated investigation that would unravel the dark secrets of a marriage gone wrong. As the authorities continued to gather evidence, the community of Waller County would be left to grapple with the aftermath of a crime that shattered their sense of peace. Angie Diaz had always been a woman with big dreams. Born in Nicaragua in October 2001, she moved to the United States to pursue a better life, far away from the struggles she had faced growing up. Her biological mother, who worked in the US to support her children, had left Angie and her siblings with her sister while she worked in Costa Rica. Angie's mother would come back every few months, sending money for her children, but the long absences made Angie long for stability. At 18, Angie's life took a significant turn when her adoptive mother, who had become like a second mother to her, was diagnosed with cancer. In response, Angie's biological mother worked hard to bring Angie and her siblings across the Mexican border into the United States. Angie, like many young immigrants, was seeking not only a fresh start, but also a way to support her family. She was ambitious and had dreams of achieving more than what her early life had offered. Arriving in Texas, Angie quickly adapted to her new life, taking a job as a cashier at a local meat market. She also used her social media to promote her personal training services, showcasing her dedication to both fitness and work. Angie's bright personality and resilience were evident to everyone who knew her, and she quickly became a beloved figure among her co-workers and customers. She dreamed of continuing her education, one day aspiring to become an accountant. But as much as Angie was focused on achieving her goals, she was also searching for connection. Her story intersected with Jared Dicus's in 2022 when they met at the meat market where she worked. Jared, a 21-year-old from a small town in Texas, had been a football player in high school and seemed like the perfect match for Angie. He was charming, and the two quickly became inseparable, with their relationship growing stronger by the day. Jared's laid-back demeanor seemed to complement Angie's ambition, and for a time, their love appeared to be the stuff of a modern romance. But beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Angie's relationship with her mother was strained. Although they had been close, Angie's decision to leave Houston to live with her aunt in Waller, Texas, created a physical and emotional distance between them. Angie's mother expressed concern about Angie's hasty decisions, especially as her daughter became more involved with Jared. But despite her reservations, Angie seemed determined to move forward with her life in Texas, and her social media posts showcased a seemingly happy relationship with her husband-to-be. However, the story Angie told her friends did not match the reality of what was happening behind closed doors. The two had only been married for a short time, less than 3 months, but it became increasingly clear to those who knew her that the marriage was far from perfect. Jared had been acting strangely, and Angie had been showing signs of distress. A few weeks before her death, Angie confided in a co-worker that she was planning to leave Jared. She had bruises on her body, some of which she explained away as accidents, but others were harder to ignore. It seemed that Jared had become controlling and increasingly aggressive. One of Angie's closest friends, a co-worker at the meat market, noticed that something was wrong. Angie had always been a bubbly, positive person, but recently she had withdrawn and seemed constantly on edge. She confided in her friend that she was planning to separate from Jared. The stress of their relationship had been taking its toll on Angie, but it wasn't until the week before her death that things escalated. Angie came to work on January 10, 2023, visibly bruised and exhausted. She explained that she and Jared had been arguing all night and that she hadn't been allowed to sleep. The emotional and physical abuse was becoming too much to bear. In the days leading up to her death, Angie had made plans to meet up with her friend for coffee. She had planned to talk about her relationship and how she was feeling trapped, but those plans would never come to fruition. On January 11th, 2023, Angie was found murdered in her home, decapitated by the very man she had once believed would be her partner for life. The night before the murder, Jared's behavior had been erratic. He had called 911 on January 8th, just 3 days before Angie's death, reporting that he had taken drugs and wasn't feeling well. The dispatcher sent paramedics to his location, but Jared called back shortly after, stating that he had made a mistake. He claimed he hadn't used drugs and was simply feeling unwell, but the signs were there. Jared had been using methamphetamine, a drug that had already taken a heavy toll on his family. His older brother Wayne had been struggling with meth use for years, and Jared's own brush with substance abuse was starting to mirror his brother's downward spiral. In the days leading up to the murder, Jared had been increasingly distant and unpredictable. His parents, who were concerned about his erratic behavior, noticed something wasn't right. He had spent money to fix up a house, but was now refusing to stay in it, asking to move back into his parents' home. His behavior was becoming more erratic by the day, and his family didn't know what to make of it. Jared's erratic actions were now being examined under the microscope of a brutal murder investigation. The evidence was starting to pile up against him. His strange behavior, his phone call to 911, and his violent tendencies all pointed to one conclusion. Jared Dicus had become unhinged, and it was only a matter of time before his actions would catch up with him. The police were beginning to piece together the narrative of a volatile relationship, one that had been full of tension and instability. The signs of abuse had been there, but Angie had remained trapped, trying to make it work in a relationship that was spiraling out of control. The day before her murder, Angie had told a co-worker that she was planning to separate from Jared, but she had not yet told him. It was clear that Angie had finally reached her breaking point. Unfortunately, her decision to leave came too late. Jared, already unstable and under the influence of drugs, would never let her go. The events that transpired on January 11th, 2023, would forever change the lives of those who loved Angie Diaz. Jared had gone from a seemingly promising young man to a suspect in the brutal murder of his wife. The unraveling of their relationship, once full of hope and excitement, was now marred by tragedy. Jared's erratic behavior, drug use, and history of violence would be central to the investigation, but the ultimate question remained: what had driven him to such a brutal act? Was it a crime of passion, or was it something darker, something lurking beneath the surface that no one could have predicted? Jared Dicus's descent into erratic behavior had been gradual, but by the time of Angie's murder, it was painfully evident. The small town of Magnolia, Texas, where Jared had lived for most of his life, had watched him grow up into a quiet, responsible young man. He was the son of Rodney and Lynn Dicus, a family well known and respected within their community. Jared had played football in high school and worked as an electrician. On the surface, he appeared to be an average young man, but beneath the facade was a growing instability that no one seemed to notice, or at least, no one could have predicted it would lead to such violence. Jared had always been close to his older brother, Wayne, but Wayne had a history with substance abuse, specifically methamphetamine, and this had been a major source of strain in the Dicus family. Wayne's troubles had cast a shadow over the family for years, and Jared, in many ways, had always been the more responsible sibling. However, in recent months, Jared had begun to show signs of distress. In November 2022, just a month before Angie's murder, Jared had been arrested for driving while intoxicated. Police had responded to a call at a local Whataburger, where Jared had reportedly been acting aggressively towards staff and customers. When officers arrived, Jared refused to calm down, punching out windows and even having to be restrained so that authorities could take a blood sample. His actions that night raised alarms among his family members, but at the time, no one could have foreseen the violent outcome that would follow. That incident had been a clear sign that Jared was spiraling out of control, but the family's response was one of concern rather than panic. His parents, Rodney and Lynn, were devastated, but hoped that Jared would learn from his mistakes. Unfortunately, things would only worsen in the weeks that followed. Around the same time as his DWI arrest, Jared's behavior became even more erratic. He started using methamphetamine, a drug that had already wreaked havoc on his brother Wayne. It was clear that Jared was heading down the same destructive path, and his family was increasingly worried. They had seen firsthand the devastating effects of addiction, and now they were witnessing Jared's life unravel in a similar manner. Despite his substance abuse problems, Jared maintained that he was fine. He was known to deny or downplay his issues when confronted. The night of January 8, 2023, just 3 days before Angie's murder, Jared called 911 in a state of distress. He claimed to have taken drugs and wasn't feeling well, requesting medical help. When the paramedics arrived, Jared quickly changed his story, saying he hadn't used any drugs at all. This strange behavior was one of the many red flags that the police would later use to assess his mental state during the investigation. While Jared was struggling with substance abuse, his marriage to Angie had been deteriorating. Angie, who had moved to the US to build a better future for herself, had dreamed of a fresh start. Her relationship with Jared had begun with promise, but over time it became clear that the relationship was fraught with tension and emotional abuse. Angie had confided in her co-workers that she was planning to separate from Jared, but she had not yet told him. One of her co-workers at the meat market, where she worked as a cashier, noticed the changes in her behavior. Angie had always been a cheerful, hard-working young woman, but in the weeks leading up to her death, she had grown more withdrawn. On January 10th, the day before her murder, Angie arrived at work with visible bruises on her shoulder. Her friend at work, concerned, asked her about the bruises, and Angie revealed that she and Jared had been arguing all night. She also mentioned that their relationship had become increasingly toxic and that she was planning to leave him. The co-worker, who had become close to Angie, encouraged her to leave Jared if the relationship was causing her pain. Angie confided in her that she would never marry again. She explained that she had become disillusioned with Jared's behavior and that she wanted to get out of the relationship. The bruises she had shown her friend weren't the first signs of abuse. Angie had been subjected to emotional and physical violence by Jared, and it seemed that she had finally reached her breaking point. The decision to leave Jared was made, but Angie had not yet told him. It seemed that she was trying to find a way to do it safely, without triggering more violence. Unfortunately, this decision would come too late. The day before her death, Angie had planned to meet with her friend for coffee. She wanted to talk in person about her situation and how she had been feeling trapped. She had hoped that a heart-to-heart conversation would give her the strength to go through with the separation. But that meeting never happened. On January 11, 2023, Angie was found dead in her home, decapitated by Jared in a horrific act of violence. By the time the police arrived at the crime scene, Jared had already been placed in custody, and the investigation began in earnest. Jared's behavior on the day of the murder raised further suspicion. He had been home around 4 a.m. after returning from work, but his family didn't see him again until 12:30 p.m. that afternoon. When Jared returned to his parents' house, his mother, Lynn, noticed that he had an unfamiliar phone in his possession. The phone was in Spanish, and she immediately suspected it belonged to Angie. When she confronted Jared, he was evasive, and it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Lynn and Rodney immediately went to Angie's house to check on her. What they found inside was a nightmare. They discovered Angie's lifeless body in a pool of blood, with her head missing. The crime scene was chaotic and horrifying, and it was clear that Jared was the one responsible for the murder. The police quickly took him into custody, and his erratic behavior was now being examined under the harsh light of a brutal crime. Despite the evidence and his strange behavior, Jared continued to deny his involvement. During his police interview, he claimed to have no memory of the murder. He spoke about hearing voices and feeling disconnected from reality. He mentioned being under the influence of drugs, but refused to fully admit what had happened. His denial, however, was not enough to absolve him of the crime. As the investigation continued, the police found surveillance footage of Jared walking into the meat market, where Angie had worked just hours after her death. He walked casually towards the fridges and grabbed a beer, as if nothing had happened. He had killed his wife only hours earlier, and yet here he was, acting as if the crime had never occurred. Jared's behavior, his substance abuse, and his violent tendencies had created the perfect storm for this tragedy. Angie had been trapped in a relationship that she couldn't escape, and Jared's unraveling mental state had led to the ultimate act of violence. While Jared claimed that drugs had made him lose control, the evidence suggested something much darker, an escalation of violence that had been building for months. Jared's denial of the crime was a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility, but it was clear to everyone involved that he had taken the life of the woman he had once promised to love and protect. The investigation was now focusing on the details of their relationship, trying to piece together what had pushed Jared to kill Angie. What had been the breaking point? Had it been the drugs, the emotional abuse, or the unresolved tension in their marriage? As the investigation into Angie Diaz's murder deepened, Jared Dicus's erratic behavior became an undeniable focal point. His strange and unsettling actions in the hours before and after the murder painted a picture of a man who was spiraling, both mentally and emotionally. But as he sat down for his police interview, Jared's attempt to deny involvement in his wife's death began to unravel, revealing a darker truth that he was unwilling, or perhaps unable, to fully confront. The police had gathered ample evidence that Jared had played a central role in Angie's murder. His behavior, the discovery of Angie's phone in his possession, and the grisly crime scene spoke volumes about his involvement. But Jared's responses during his interview with investigators were laced with confusion and contradiction. Despite the mounting evidence, Jared refused to take full responsibility for what had happened. He spoke about being under the influence of drugs, methamphetamine specifically, and described feeling disconnected from reality, as if he were a spectator rather than a participant in the events that had led to Angie's brutal death. When the police began their questioning, they started by trying to establish a timeline and asking Jared what had happened. His answers were vague and evasive. He spoke in generalities, mentioning the drugs, his mental state, and a supposed psychotic break, but avoided giving direct details about the murder. His reluctance to speak clearly raised more suspicion. The detectives, knowing that Jared had been caught in the act of murder, needed him to admit what he had done. Jared's body language during the interview was telling. He fidgeted, rubbed his hands together nervously, and avoided making eye contact. He was clearly under immense stress, and his attempts to minimize his role in the crime seemed more like a defense mechanism than a genuine statement of innocence. The investigators, however, pressed him relentlessly, hoping that the pressure would eventually lead to the truth. They appealed to his emotions, trying to get him to feel the weight of the situation and admit to the tragedy he had caused. "Jared, this isn't going away," one of the detectives said, trying to break through his emotional walls. "Your family, her family, they're all heartbroken. You're going to have to face this one way or another." The detective's words cut through the tension in the room, but Jared's response was still filled with confusion and denial. He claimed that he had no clear recollection of the events that led to Angie's death. It was as though he was trying to distance himself from the horror of his actions. Despite his refusal to fully confess, Jared did begin to offer a fragmented version of what had happened. He said that he and Angie had argued the night before, and that when he returned home from work in the early hours of January 11th, Angie was awake. According to Jared, they had talked, but the argument quickly escalated. He mentioned that he had been under the influence of drugs, which he claimed caused him to lose control of his actions. However, Jared's statement about his mental state was riddled with inconsistencies. He mentioned hearing voices telling him what to do, as if some external force was controlling his actions. This narrative, though strange, seemed to be his way of justifying his behavior, making it appear as though he was not entirely responsible for what had transpired. But as the investigators pressed him, it became clear that Jared's attempt to dissociate himself from the murder was a desperate ploy. Despite his claims of not remembering the details, his actions spoke volumes about his involvement. One of the most chilling moments of the interview came when Jared was asked directly about how he had killed Angie. The questions seemed to rattle him, and for a moment, he was silent. Then, in a disturbing and almost detached manner, he admitted that he had decapitated her. "I cut her head off," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. But when pressed further about the details of the murder, he seemed to falter. "I don't know. I don't know why I did it," he stammered, his confusion and guilt apparent. The detectives did not let up. They asked him to describe the events in greater detail, hoping to get a clearer understanding of his mindset during the murder. Jared seemed to slip between moments of lucidity and confusion. He described how he had stabbed Angie multiple times, but when asked about the sequence of events, his answers were unclear. He claimed he couldn't remember whether the stabbing occurred before or after he decapitated her. He mentioned putting her head in the bathtub, but his explanation was muddled and incoherent. I didn't mean to. It just happened," he murmured, the words almost as if they were forced out of him. It was at this point that the investigators began to realize that Jared's narrative was likely an attempt to excuse his actions, rather than an honest admission of guilt. He was clearly struggling with the weight of what he had done, but he was unwilling to take full accountability. His disjointed statement suggested that he was trying to make sense of his actions, but deep down he knew the truth. He had killed his wife. The question now was why. Theories began to emerge about what had driven Jared to this horrific act. Some believed that his drug use played a significant role in his violent outburst, while others speculated that deeper issues within his relationship with Angie had been the catalyst for the murder. Angie had been planning to leave him, and the emotional strain of their troubled marriage could have pushed Jared to a breaking point. His abusive tendencies had been building over time, and the combination of substance abuse, jealousy, and anger seemed to have culminated in a horrific act of violence. In the following days, as the investigation progressed, more details about Jared's behavior came to light. The police discovered surveillance footage from the meat market where Angie worked, showing Jared casually walking into the store just hours after his wife's murder. He went straight to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and opened it in the parking lot, as though nothing had happened. This chilling image painted a stark contrast to the man who had just taken the life of his wife. Jared's denial of his actions continued in the face of overwhelming evidence, but the psychological toll of the interview seemed to be taking its toll on him. His body language became more defensive, and he started to close himself off emotionally. He claimed that he had been lost during the murder, as if he had been disassociated from his own body. However, the police were not swayed by his attempts to avoid responsibility. The evidence was clear, and Jared's actions in the aftermath of the murder spoke volumes about his role in Angie's death. As the interview came to a close, the detectives left Jared alone in the interrogation room, hoping that the time away from questioning would allow him to reflect on what he had done. But the silence in the room was deafening. Jared curled up on the floor, his body language speaking louder than words. It was a sign of guilt, of a man trying to come to terms with the horror he had inflicted. Yet, in his mind, he seemed unable or unwilling to accept the full weight of his actions. Jared's confession, though incomplete and riddled with contradictions, was an undeniable step toward uncovering the truth behind Angie Diaz's murder. The investigation had only begun, but one thing was certain. Jared Dicus had taken his wife's life in a brutal act of violence, and his attempts to distance himself from the crime could not change the undeniable evidence of his guilt. The shock of Angie Diaz's brutal murder reverberated far beyond the small community of Magnolia, Texas. Friends, family, and co-workers struggled to comprehend how a young woman full of ambition and hope for the future could have been taken so violently from them. Angie had come to the United States with dreams of a better life, only to meet a tragic end at the hands of the person she trusted most. Jared Dicus, once seen as the loving husband of Angie, was now facing the consequences of his actions. His eventual confession, however reluctant and evasive, only served to underscore the horrific nature of the crime. As the investigation continued, the depth of Jared's instability became even clearer. The police had already gathered a significant amount of evidence, including surveillance footage of Jared stealing a beer from the meat market where Angie had worked just hours after the murder. The fact that he had acted so casually in the aftermath of such a gruesome crime was chilling. The family had found Angie's body, and Jared's strange behavior during the investigation had left little doubt about his involvement. But despite this, Jared still seemed unable to fully acknowledge the extent of his responsibility for Angie's death. Jared's bizarre behavior during the police interviews was also telling. He claimed that drugs had caused him to lose control, that he had been acting under the influence of methamphetamine, and that he had been hearing voices. However, his refusal to take full responsibility for his actions left investigators skeptical. It became apparent that Jared was trying to separate himself from the crime, using drugs as a convenient excuse for his violence. His defense lawyer would later argue that Jared had been suffering from a drug-induced psychotic break, but the evidence suggested that this was no more than a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of his actions. While Jared continued to deny the full extent of his role in the crime, his family and friends struggled to make sense of his actions. His parents, Rodney and Lynn, had raised him to be a responsible young man, but they were now grappling with the fact that their son had killed his wife. They were torn between their love for him and the horror of what he had done. Rodney had even made a heartbreaking 911 call, expressing his belief that the situation could have been prevented. "Oh my God, please hurry," he cried into the phone. "There's something wrong with my son." Jared's erratic behavior wasn't just limited to the day of the murder. His previous history of emotional instability, substance abuse, and violent outbursts had been well documented. He had been arrested for driving under the influence just a month before Angie's death, and his family had noticed the signs of his downward spiral, yet no one could have predicted that his mental state would deteriorate so rapidly, leading to such an unthinkable act. Angie had been planning to leave him, but she had not yet gathered the courage to confront him. Tragically, she never had the chance. As the case moved forward, Jared was charged with the murder of Angie Diaz. The evidence against him was overwhelming, from the blood-stained knife found next to her body to the chilling discovery of her severed head in the bathtub. Jared's arrest was a stark reminder of how deeply domestic violence and substance abuse can destroy lives, and how the pressures of a toxic relationship can push someone to commit acts of unthinkable violence. The case also brought to light the toxic dynamics of Jared and Angie's marriage. While Jared had been the perpetrator of the violence, the relationship itself had been fraught with tension and control. Angie had come to the US with dreams of building a future for herself and her family, but those dreams were shattered by Jared's possessive and abusive behavior. She had shown signs of physical abuse in the weeks leading up to her death, and she had even confided in friends and co-workers that she was planning to leave him. But Angie's escape from the relationship came too late, and her tragic death served as a stark reminder of how difficult it can be for victims of domestic abuse to break free from their abusers. As Jared's trial loomed, the public's attention turned to the question of his mental state at the time of the crime. The defense argued that Jared had been experiencing a drug-induced psychotic break, a claim that was supported by his drug use and erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murder. However, the prosecution countered by pointing out that Jared had been in control enough to cover up his crime and act in a calculated manner after the murder. He had even tried to clean up the crime scene, which suggested a level of awareness and intent that was inconsistent with the defense's argument. Jared's defense attorney also raised the issue of his history with substance abuse, claiming that methamphetamine had exacerbated his emotional instability and contributed to the violence that led to Angie's death. However, the prosecution argued that while drugs may have played a role, they were not an excuse for the murder. Jared had made the decision to end his wife's life, and the evidence suggested that he had been fully aware of his actions at the time. Ultimately, Jared pled guilty to the murder of Angie Diaz. In August 2024, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crime. The family of Angie Diaz was left to cope with the loss of their loved one, a young woman with so much potential who had been taken far too soon. Angie's death was a devastating blow to those who knew her, but they vowed to remember her for the joyful, ambitious person she had been. Her family expressed their desire to honor her memory by celebrating her life, and they sought to move forward with love and resilience, despite the heartbreak of her untimely death. While the legal consequences for Jared Dicus were significant, they did little to bring true closure to Angie's family. They had lost a daughter, a sister, and a friend, and no sentence could ever make up for the pain of her absence. What was clear, however, was that the tragedy of Angie's death was not just a senseless act of violence. It was the culmination of a long and painful history of abuse, control, and emotional manipulation. Angie's story served as a reminder of the dangers that lurk within toxic relationships and the devastating consequences of untreated mental health issues and substance abuse. In the years to come, Angie's family would continue to grieve her loss, but they also hoped that her story would serve as a warning to others. They wanted people to understand the signs of domestic abuse, to recognize the importance of supporting victims, and to take action before it was too late. Angie's death was a tragedy, but her family vowed to honor her memory by fighting for justice and advocating for those who couldn't speak for themselves. As for Jared, the court had determined that he would face the consequences of his actions. The 40-year sentence would keep him behind bars for decades, but it would never be enough to undo the pain he had caused. The murder of Angie Diaz had shaken a community, torn apart a family, and left a dark stain on the memory of a young life full of promise. The echoes of her tragic death would resonate for years to come, as her family and friends continued to mourn the loss of a woman they had once known, loved, and cherished.